Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us. I'm Deborah Archer, and I'm really delighted to be here for what feels like an especially timely conversation. We're living through a moment when the idea of equality itself is under attack, when diversity, equity, and inclusion efforts are being rolled back. Courts are narrowing civil rights protection. They're dismantling the very infrastructure of justice and equality. And many institutions are pulling back rather than leaning in. So the question isn't just what we believe about equality, but how we actually advance it, how we build change that lasts. And that's exactly what two of my amazing colleagues and friends, Kenji Yoshino and David Glasgow, take up in their wonderful new book, How Equality Wins. Together, they bring a rare combination of rigorous scholarship and on-the-ground experience. Kenji is the Chief Justice Earl Warren Professor of Constitutional Law at NYU School of Law, and is without question one of the country's most influential thinkers on identity and belonging. And David is the Executive Director of the Meltzer Center for Diversity, Inclusion, and Belonging, where he works closely with organizations and leaders translating equality values into meaningful institutional practices. Kenji and David, thank you so much for being willing to let me join you to talk about your new book.
Thank you so much for moderating this discussion, Deborah.
Yes, thank you, Deborah.
Great. So I want to begin by zooming out a bit and asking you to help us make sense of the landscape that we're in right now. All of us will remember that a few years ago, diversity, equity, and inclusion efforts seemed to have real momentum across universities and corporations and public life. But as you know, especially when we're talking about civil rights and progress, is always met with retrenchment. And so today we hear people just declaring that DEI is dead. So from your perspective, what has actually changed? Is this a sudden backlash? Or is it part of a longer historical cycle in the struggle for equality?
I think it's really both that, as you say, Deborah, and you know this as well as or better than we do, it is a two steps forward, one step back kind of dynamic. And if I could just pan out and be hopeful about it, I will say equality has faced far worse challenges in the nation's history than the one that we're confronting today, as dire as today's circumstances may seem. So we are a nation that's lived through, slavery and Jim Crow. We're a nation that's lived through coverture and the legalization of domestic violence. We're a nation that's lived through the criminalization of gay identity and the institutionalization of Native Americans and people with disabilities, the internment of the Japanese. I could go on. And every single time that we have confronted that inequality, the value of equality and the value of inclusion have prevailed. So yes, this is a step back from where we were in the heady post-murder of George Floyd days when it seemed like everybody wanted to get a piece of the action with regard to DEI. But this too is something we believe that we can move past, right, to create a more inclusive America where just the ambit of who counts as we the people is again expanded. Yeah. If I were to tag onto that and say, because I said there's a long arc and a short arc, the more very kind of technocratic arc after that sweeping tour of US history that I want to highlight is this is actually not a product only of the current administration. I think oftentimes people date the backlash that we're experiencing to the inauguration of this current administration. But both David and I believe, and curious as to your views on this, that it began a bit earlier than that in 2023, because the executive branch can't do anything about changing statutes. It can't do anything about the interpretation of those federal statutes by the United States Supreme Court. So it can put the muscle of enforcement around those statutes, but it can't change the fundamental underlying law. So the real change came in 2023 with the Students for Fair Admission versus Harvard test, the Students for Fair Admissions versus Harvard case, where the Supreme Court abolished racially conscious affirmative action in higher education, but also threw away sort of 45 years of precedent and allied itself with a theory of discrimination that says there has to be absolute symmetry in between how different racial groups are treated and presumably how other groups are treated as well. And that really was the beginning of the legal regulation of diversity,
Yeah.
equity, and inclusion.
And I'm so glad you lifted up two of those points. The first is that you point out that we've been through so much worse. And in fact, today we have more powerful tools than the folks who came before us in fighting those fights. And so it should keep us optimistic that we can also achieve our goals in this context. And also, many people were having this conversation in the media or, in more public circles. They focus on political actors in the current administration and really ignore, I think, to our detriment, the role that the Supreme Court has played in getting us to the moment where we are at now. So I appreciate you highlighting those things. Another piece of the challenge, I think, around our current discussion around DEI is not everyone having a shared understanding of what DEI is. You describe DEI not as a discrete program or an acronym, but as part of a broader ongoing project of equality. And I'm really drawn to that framing because so much of my own work tries to move us away from thinking about justice as a set of isolated policies or compliance exercise and toward understanding it as structural and historical and cumulative, something we build over time through institutions and systems. So can you talk about what you mean by the project of equality? And how does stepping back into those longer historical arcs change the way we interpret this moment of backlash and respond to this moment?
Yeah, absolutely. I worry a lot that this term or acronym DEI has come to be associated with a pretty narrow set of technocratic HR practices. So people think of it, for example, as a bias training that they might have to go to when they start a new job, or a set of Heritage Month celebrations at their school or university, as you say, a kind of set of scattershot programs. But if you trace the history of this work of DEI, as the sociologist Frank Dobbin has done in his book, Inventing Equal Opportunity, it really emerged out of the civil rights movement in the 60s as a way of embedding the value of equality in civil rights legislation in the daily life of organizations, of looking at what can workplaces, schools, universities, other institutions to ensure that this value of equality enshrined in law is actually made real in how people experience their daily lives. And so we sort of situate the project of equality in that sort of historical narrative, but we also define it in the book as reflecting a few core tenets so that, readers can orient themselves to whether or not they agree with the project of equality and who our opponents might be in this book. So the first tenet is simply that equality is a birthright. All human beings are equal in dignity and moral worth. And so obviously there are still people today who deny that foundational premise, who believe that there is a hierarchy, that some groups should be dominant, belong on top of that social hierarchy. We pit ourselves very much against those opponents. The second tenet is that equality is both material and it's dignitary. So we care about the fair allocation of resources, job opportunities, promotion, income, wealth inequality, those kinds of issues. But we also care about reducing stigma and enhancing respect for one another across our differences as human beings. So those people to the left who might say, oh, this is all identity politics, we should only care about material equality issues, we want to say no, both the material and the dignitary aspects of equality are important. Thirdly, we want to say that equality is still an unrealized promise for many historically marginalized groups. So there we kind of pit ourselves against maybe people who are more kind of moderate or center-right, conservative in their political orientation, who perhaps think we've solved all of these problems. Racism, sexism, all of the isms were problems of the past, and now we live in a colorblind meritocracy. To the extent that anyone truly believes that, looking at what's going on in the world right now, we want to say that there is still much more work to be done. And then finally, we define the project of equality by saying organizations need to actually take affirmative steps to make the promise of equality real. In other words, you have to go further than just putting in place neutral rules and telling everyone to treat one another equally. You actually have to take affirmative steps, and that could be through systemic work to de-bias processes for how you recruit people, how you promote people, the opportunities that you give people inside schools and universities and workplaces, but that you need to engage in those positive measures rather than just sitting back and assuming that neutral rules are going to take care of it.
Yeah. You raised colorblind equality, and I want to kind of dive into that a little bit deeper. You talk about your opponents, and often opponents of diversity, equity, inclusion initiatives, would say that they simply support colorblind equality. And for many people, that language sounds neutral. It even sounds fair or principled. But I worry that it asks us to pretend we're starting from a level playing field when we're anything but. You were talking about some of that unfinished work that we have to do. And if you ignore history, you ignore hierarchy. If you refuse to see race, you often end up entrenching those very inequalities you claim to not notice. So the question I have for the two of you is, what gets lost when equality is reduced to colorblindness? And what realities about power, about history, about structural disadvantage does that framework make harder or even impossible for us to see and address?
I think we can really begin with the term itself, colorblindness. So as the brilliant legal scholar Neil Gotanda has pointed out, colorblindness is a really terrible metaphor because if I'm medically colorblind, then I literally cannot tell the difference between two colors, say red and green. But if I'm socially or juridically colorblind, then it's not that I can't tell the difference between a Caucasian person and an Asian person. It's just that I pretend that I can, or I aspire to be kind, to do that. But because that project is so fraught and incomplete, it's always going to be unsuccessful. And it's going to sort of reason from a predicate that is simply false, right? That I can't tell this difference when I actually can. And one of the things that we find really interesting that we talk about in the book, which we call kind of sensory deprivation equality, is that so many of the tropes from the right of inequality are about not seeing or not apprehending the real differences, whether those be historical or other cultural or otherwise, that exist among us as human beings. So another good example, moving from the visual to the oral here, would be don't ask, don't tell, and the LGBT context, which was the policy in our military for many years. The idea was you're not supposed to say that you're gay, and we won't ask in return, right? So that was the bargain. And so that seems like an analog of colorblindness and saying, make it easy for us to disattend that you even exist. And it's very hard to imagine that we could have an equal society when the full existence of the human being is not even being acknowledged, much less kind of apprehended and dignified.
Yeah. I want to shift a little bit to some of the changes in approach that you recommend, because I think one of the wonderful things about equality, how equality wins, is that you are moving us to think differently and act differently and move differently in this space. You challenge what you call orthodoxy within the equality space and argue for more room for debate, disagreement, and even a little imperfection. Some people would think that's a pretty provocative claim. I want you to talk a little bit about what worries you about orthodoxy and how might it unintentionally undermine the very goals that it seeks to advance.
Yeah, absolutely. I think this is one of the more provocative claims in the book. A lot of people who've made these kinds of arguments will do it, package it as part of a broader attack on what they call cancel culture. And, we don't use the term cancel culture in the book because we find it often misleads people into thinking that if you cancel someone, it's a kind of permanent out into the wilderness, and that very rarely happens to anyone. And the people that it does happen to often kind of deserve to be cancelled, frankly. So we're focusing on more of the kind of everyday occurrences that many folks have experienced within communities that are pro-DEI, of which we consider ourselves to be a part, in which they feel shut down, shamed, kind of unable to share what they think, unable to express doubts or disagreements without feeling like they could potentially get shut out of the community, perhaps leading to self-censoring and the like. And, while I completely understand where that's coming from, and while, if someone engages in truly egregious or bigoted behavior, of course, it deserves condemnation. More broadly, what we worry about in the book is that that kind of orthodoxy or intolerance of broader debate and disagreement is impeding the goals of the movement. So one obvious way that it's doing that is by creating what the economist Timur Kuran calls preference falsification. People won't tell you what they truly think. And then what they'll do is go off in secret, like at an election, and then tell you what they really think. And all of a sudden, we're shocked to find out what people really believe in ways that would have been helpful for us to know and manage and engage with beforehand. But it also has downsides because it can actually make the allyship of people more fragile or more shallow. So Natalie Wynn, the political commentator, has pointed out that if you sort of beat people down with a slogan like trans women are women, and you expect people to kind of invoke this slogan and believe this slogan at that kind of superficial level without allowing them to express, say, doubts or uncertainties that they might have about that proposition, then they're going to only believe it at a surface level. And when it gets challenged, when they say read, an article or hear an opinion from someone that's challenging that premise, they're much more likely to fall prey to accepting that kind of argument and disbelieving what you tried to get them to believe with the slogan. So creating more room for discussion, debate, expression of doubt is actually, I think, a way to more effectively cultivate deeper allies over the long term. And then one final sort of thing that I'll mention is that I think if we cultivate in our community the sense that we are the folks who really believe in free speech, in open debate, we give you the grace to make mistakes, we treat people as the imperfect humans that we all are, and we don't expect people to be perfect, that is going to create such an incredibly sharp contrast with what we see on the other side, which is that what we're seeing on the other side is cancel culture on steroids, right? We're seeing book bans. We're seeing telling teachers and professors what they are and aren't allowed to talk about in the classroom. We're seeing crackdowns on protests, threatening and suing media companies, right? These are what opponents of DEI are doing. And so I think if we can really cement ourselves as the folks who care about free speech and debate and open conversation, we can more effectively take aim at all of the crackdowns on free speech that our opponents are engaging in.
And I really appreciate you helping us see that through line and highlighting that through line through so many of the things that we are seeing going on in our communities, in our schools, and our workplaces. Continuing to focus on what some folks might think are provocative statements in the book, you also encourage the equality movement to widen its tent, to think more intentionally about religious communities, working class people, boys and men, ideological conservatives. Some folks worry that broadening the frame around diversity, equity, and inclusion risks diluting attention from communities that have historically borne and really do currently bear the brunt of exclusion and inequality. So what gives you first the sense that these folks are not included under the current tent? And how do you recommend we expand without erasing or flattening those histories and reality?
It's a really wonderful question, and I'm going to respond with a kind of analogy or a metaphor, which is that we want to think about this as a physician would and say, who is sick, who actually needs our help, right? And that's really the frame through which we look at both the expansion and the prioritization of groups within diversity, equity, and inclusion. So to start with the expansion point, I think a physician would say just because you belong to some privileged cohort doesn't necessarily mean that you're not suffering something that I can help you with. You're a human being. I can, help you, help alleviate that suffering. So when we think about sort of claims of expansion, we think about three: claims of enforcement, claims of symmetry, and claims of extension. And you've really already done our work for us by rattling off those groups. But just to connect them to the ideas that we're offering. Claims of enforcement would be there are certain groups that are already protected under civil rights law, like people of faith, that have never gotten their due, in our view, in the diversity, equity, and inclusion paradigm. And so that would be a really obvious place to start, to say you're protected by the First Amendment, you're protected by civil rights law. Why wouldn't you be protected under DEI? Claims of extension, if I could actually go there second, is probably also relatively intuitive to most listeners, because the notion is, well, we haven't exhausted, history has not closed a canon of people who have suffered oppression in society. And so we could extend our solicitude beyond what civil rights laws protect, beyond what DEI currently protects, to welcome in new groups like veterans, like people of low socioeconomic status, like first-gen individuals and the like. And I think where we might get into the most trouble is what we call claims of symmetry, where we say, even if you are an empowered group within a classification, that doesn't mean that all lights are turning green for you all the time. So we think in this instance of boys and men, looking at Richard Reeves's terrific work about how boys have more kind of modest educational attainments currently relative to girls and elementary and secondary education. We look at the fact that men have a suicide rate of dying by suicide that is more than twice that of women. And so I can actually think that it is a travesty, as I do, that women are, 10%, about 10% of Fortune 500 CEOs, and to wish for a day when there would be parity between men and women. And I can also say, if men are suffering in certain ways, I can look at those things as well. So I think the look at it as a physician would, or a public health person would be to say, look where the pain is. And if there's an inequity or a pain, go to where that inequity or that pain is and try to solve it. That does not answer your powerful question, which is to say, can we do that without diluting the historical focus that we have had on people of color, on women, more recently the LGBTQ plus community? And our answer is really, let's carry the metaphor of the physician to say a physician can still triage. Like, one person's paper cut is not treated the same as another person's flesh wound. So if a physician is triaging in a hospital emergency room, they can actually say, well, I'm going to do this first, right, before I go to this other thing, right? But it doesn't mean that anyone needs to be turned away from that emergency room if they're suffering from an actual pain that the doctor is able to resolve. I think the final thing that I'll say on that, Deborah, and we're both constitutional law scholars, if we had waited to say we are going to solve all the problems that people of color have experienced in this country under our equal protection jurisprudence before we move on to any other group, we would never have, right, as we started to do in 1973 in the constitutional law jurisprudence around the Equal Protection Clause, we would never have moved on to women, right? Because we still have not solved any of the major issues or that we were facing in the 1970s with regard to people of color. That may be a slight exaggeration, but it's a rare moment of pessimism from me, right? So we would never have moved on if we had said we need to finish with this group before we move on to anyone else. So our view is that it's both ethical and possible to sort of walk and chew gum at the same time, and to say that the lodestar here should be the physician analogy.
Yeah. And I really do like the physician analogy. One of the really wonderful things about how equality wins is that you have many examples that help us rethink, different frameworks that help us move through this work. And one idea you advance is a shift from what you call lifting to leveling. And I'd love for you to unpack that. What's the difference between these two approaches, and how does that shift change the kinds of policies and strategies we should be pursuing?
Yeah, so I think the best way to explain the distinction is to draw on a famous example, which is orchestras. And symphony orchestras in the 1970s were only 5% women. And so they wanted to increase the percentage of women in the orchestras. And what they could have done was adopted what we call a lifting approach, which is essentially to put a thumb on the scale for women, to say, we're going to give women a bump, a boost, a preference in their audition score in order to try to bring them up closer to parity with men, right? So this is what some folks might consider, I guess, a form of affirmative action where, race could be a plus factor in a kind of holistic assessment in order to uplift a historically marginalized group in that particular domain. But what the orchestras actually did was engage in a strategy we call leveling, which is to de-bias the actual audition process itself in order to create the level playing field for the folks auditioning. So it set up a screen so that musicians would perform behind the screen and the musical directors would not be able to identify the demographics of the musician. They would just listen to the quality of the music when they made their assessment. And researchers have studied this and concluded that just the mere implementation of that screen increased by 50% the chance that a woman would proceed through to the audition, through to the next audition rounds. And so now symphony orchestras, my understanding is, are more than 35% women now. Yeah. So that's one example of, moving from lifting to leveling. But in that chapter, we describe many other ways in which you can de-bias systems in order to create a level playing field. So for example, if you are recruiting candidates for a job, you can create a structured recruitment process where you have job relevant criteria that you have established that you're assessing everyone against, where you're asking all the candidates the same questions, where you're scoring them against a scoring rubric. And there's a lot of social science research to suggest that that kind of structured recruitment approach is much less likely to involve bias than an open-ended conversation where you just get to know someone and figure out whether you like them or whether they have cultural fit with your organization. So again, with that structured interview process, you're not doing a bump, a preference, you're not engaging in any kind of affirmative action, you're treating all candidates the same, but you are still creating a much fairer process for everyone going through the interview in ways that will hopefully mitigate bias. And so that, to us, is a fruitful way of continuing the work of equality even in the current landscape, because the Supreme Court is not going to say you are unable to create a system that treats everyone fairly in a recruitment process. You are unable to de-bias a system. It's really the lifting forms of DEI work that have become more legally risky in the current environment.
I want to talk about another shift in frame that you propose. And David, you were earlier talking about all of the kind of other pieces we're seeing going on around in this space and other challenges. And one of the challenges that we're seeing is a wave of legal challenges to scholarships and fellowships and targeted opportunity programs. You both suggest moving from cohorts to content or from cohorts to character. Can you explain what those pivots look like in practice and whether they're really strategic adaptations or deeper philosophical shifts? And would those shifts be protected from further legal challenges in the way that Kenji was describing those legal challenges earlier, if the goal is still ultimately increasing diversity, equity, and inclusion?
I'd love to take that one up. So before I do, though, I want to just harken back, since this is a conversation, and to say some listeners might have thought, well, David just talked about the orchestra screen. Isn't that a form of gender blindness, right? But I would say that, that form of blindness, right, or, not anonymization, let's put it that way, is much more like medical color blindness, right? Because you literally don't know. You don't know whether someone's a man or woman any more than you can tell if you're medically colorblind, distinguish between the colors red and green. Whereas juridical color blindness or social color blindness or social gender blindness is very different from that, which is to say, I'm just going to try, right? I know I can tell the difference between a man and a woman or a person of color and a Caucasian person, but I'm going to try and pretend that that difference doesn't exist or that I can repress it, right? So just to clear up that, it doesn't, lest we created confusion there. So cohorts to content and cohorts to character, I think of this as moving in kind of opposite directions. Of one is kind of up switching and the other one is kind of down switching. Cohorts to content is, I think, best described by what happened in the wake of Students for Fair Admission in our very own profession, where law firms got sued, 3 law firms in particular in the first round, for having fellowships that said this fellowship is for underrepresented, among other things, racial groups or sexual orientations in the legal profession. And that was challenged by Edward Blum, who was the architect of the SFFA case, on the ground that it was discriminatory under Title VII or Section 1981, depending on what the particular program was. And so we looked at that and we said, well, wait a minute, the right shift here to preserve this against attack is to move from cohorts to content. And this is, in fact, what all three of the law firms did, which is to say, we still have this fellowship. We will no longer close it. So it's open to anyone who wants to apply. But the restriction will now travel not with who can apply, but with the theme of the fellowship. In other words, we're going to move from cohorts to content. So anyone can apply for this fellowship, but this fellowship is still about advancing diversity and inclusion within the legal profession. And that shift at least was good enough for Edward Blum because he settled all three of those suits immediately thereafter. So all three of those suits went away because this move was made. So we think it's very powerful. David and I, at times in the book say we do this because we think it's strategically a good idea, and other times say on principle, right? We think that we should have been doing this, all along, right? We can sort of argue that both ways, right? With regard to that particular shift from cohorts to content, because on the one hand, it, fails to target people as closely as we might like. So that would be the downside. But on the positive side, it allows you to actually draw in, allies into the conversation who otherwise, might not have been able to find a place to express their commitment to the values of diversity and inclusion. So it's ultimately like an empirical question more than it is a theoretical question, whether the positives outweigh the negatives. Moving now to cohorts to content, I call that down switching because it goes from the group down to the level of the individual. And here we have Supreme Court authority that says we're allowed to do this. So in that third to last paragraph in the Students for Fair Admissions opinion, Chief Justice Roberts, writing for the majority of the court, said, of course, people are still allowed to write on their application essays about how race was a source of inspiration or discrimination in their life. And a college is allowed to take that into account in deciding whether to admit them. So I feel like this is an enormous opportunity because the distinction that the court is drawing there, I believe, is it used to be that everyone who belonged to this racial group got the bump. Now it's not everyone who gets the preference, but just the person who wrote the essay, who decided to write the essay and who wrote a good essay, right, about their experiences with this particular identity. So it makes sense to me because we're talking about the individual rather than about the group. Again, I think SFFA was wrongly decided, but that is a loophole I will gladly take. And in fact, some organizations have adopted that in thinking about how to do recruitment or offer fellowships or do promotions and the like. So that's extremely promising. With regard to whether or not those are still vulnerable, there is one vulnerability that we want to really highlight in the book, which is to say, in that third to last paragraph, Chief Justice Roberts also said, you cannot do indirectly what you can't do directly. So it has to be a real shift. It can't just be a performative shift from cohorts to content or from cohorts to character, because then it will just be seen as pretext. And the court has, shown that it has a desire to kind of poke at pretext and to say this is illegal if it is a pretext. So just to simplify it a little bit, if we were to say we're going to have a first gen, program, but the first gen program was something that you concocted because you wanted to continue to do race-based preferences, so it's kind of old wine in new bottles, then that would still be illegal because the only thing that you've changed is the form of the program rather than the actual substance. But if you really did have a first gen program and, it benefited, white, individuals from Appalachia who had never gotten those families had never gone to college before, that would be absolutely fine, right? And, because racial minorities, other minorities are starting from a lower starting point, a rising tide will lift all boats, but it will lift some boats more than others because the boats didn't start out in the same position. So our view of pretext is to say, as long as you didn't intentionally create a program in order to sort of chuckle up your sleeve and say, oh, this is old wine in new bottles, the fact that it has a positive disparate impact, right, on a historically protected group is not, in the run of cases, going to be enough in order to make it illegal. So we think these strategies are actionable. We think they're legal. Well, we know they're legal, and we think that they're actually politically popular as well.
Okay. So we are running short on time. I want to ask you two more questions. And the first is, I spend a lot of my day trying to convince people to resist, to push back, to hold the line. And for leaders in universities and nonprofits and corporations, this can feel like a moment of real legal and political risk. So some are pulling back. They're not willing to hold the line. And you argue, just as I believe, that retreat carries risks too. Can you talk about what those dangers are, legal, institutional, and moral, the dangers of disengaging from the work of equality?
Absolutely. So we describe several risks of retreat in the book. One of them is legal, which is that despite all of the lawsuits being brought by anti-DEI conservative activist groups and reverse discrimination plaintiffs and the like, it still remains the case that most discrimination complaints are brought by members of historically marginalized groups, people of color, women, LGBTQ individuals, and the like. And so if organizations are too quick to rip away programs that they've established to foster fairness and inclusivity and opportunity for members of those historically marginalized groups, and as a result, their institution becomes more unwelcoming, more hostile, more toxic, where it's less fair, where they have less opportunities to get mentorship and access to jobs and promotions and the like, you are perhaps reducing your risk of getting sued by a disgruntled, white male opponent of DEI, but you're increasing your risk of getting sued by those historically marginalized groups. And so you really have to take both of those legal risks into account. We also talk about the reputational costs associated with retreating. We've seen that with boycotts of major companies that have retreated publicly from DEI, as well as from research showing that employee morale in organizations that have pulled back from DEI has gone down, where people trust your brand less, they see you as less aligned with their own values and make it harder for you to reach consumers, to recruit candidates that you may want to recruit. And that ties in with a third risk, which is temporal, that the youngest generations, poll after poll shows, are the most committed to the values of diversity, equity, and inclusion. And of course, those younger generations are the ones that are increasingly taking over institutions. So it's just as a matter of forward long-term thinking, ensuring that you're not just making decisions, snap decisions based on the political currents of the moment, but how are you actually going to tap into the values of the people who are going to be populating your institutions over the long term. And then finally, we talk about global risks in this area, which is that this retrenchment on DEI is happening in the United States, but there are many other countries around the globe that are going full steam in the opposite direction. So my home country of Australia, for example, just last year passed a landmark law requiring companies to adopt 3 gender equality targets, one of which needs to be numerical, right? So for example, a representation goal for the advancement of women. There are other countries in Europe, for instance, that have requirements around diversity on corporate boards, pay equity requirements, even countries that you might not necessarily expect in the kind of European or Commonwealth area, countries like Japan or Brazil or India are also moving forward on many of these issues. And so if you are a global organization of any kind and you are thinking about maintaining a cohesive brand identity or adopting a strategy on these topics that can work globally, it would be a big mistake to pull back from DEI just because of the environment in the United States in ways that could create legal, regulatory, or cultural backlash abroad.
Thanks for that explanation. I appreciate it very much. I want to end by asking you both to answer a question that people often ask me, and that's in a moment when many people feel exhausted or discouraged or overwhelmed, what gives you hope? Where do you see signs that this broader project of equality is still alive and evolving?
Yeah, the great English scholar Elaine Scarry always talks about statistical and narrative compassion. So, and she says, some people have more of one than the other. Like some people reason through numbers, others through stories. And I think I'm both. And so I take comfort in statistics, and I take great comfort in narratives and storytelling. So let me give you an example of each. On the statistical side, I just think that the brute demographic reality of our country, much less, inter matrixed or latticed with the world, just means that we have to do diversity, equity, and inclusion. So we live in a society that is going to be majority minority with regard to race sometime in the 2040s. And in the under 18 cohort, that is already the case, that no race is a majority of the population. We live in a society where since 2019, 50% of college educated individuals are women. We live in a society, this, despite the fact that I belong to this community, was the one that shocked me the most, or maybe because of that. According to Gallup, 25% of Gen Z identifies as LGBTQ+. So that's just the tip of the iceberg. I'm not even talking about global effects. I'm not even talking about other cohorts, but just those three statistics always bring home to me this idea of, if the world is getting that complex demographically, and historically unheard minorities are actually raising their voices, how could anyone hope to survive, much less thrive, unless they were able to bond, to empathize, to love, to work across difference? So that's the statistical case. And I think the narrative case is, more just talking to people, right? I mean, this conversation that we're having tonight, right? And everyone who's listening in, the myriad of conversations that I've been able to have with people who are just really outraged at this assault on what they thought they had already achieved, and that they thought was the birthright that they had finally been able to achieve, which is, a modicum of dignity, a modicum of equality in our very fractious society. So I think the thing I hear more and more often, like a drumbeat, is we're just going backwards, right? We're being taken back in a way that we refuse to go back, right, to the 1950s America, or the way that we never were, right, in those years. And so those stories help me a lot, because I think the most dangerous thing to feel right now is that you're powerless or that you're alone. And if you actually just have these conversations, you realize incredibly quickly that you are neither alone nor powerless.
Yeah, and I want to just build on, where Kenji just landed, just by saying, I speak with so many audiences who are deeply passionate about the values underpinning the work of diversity, equity, and inclusion. Those individuals are not going away. There are too many of us out there in the world. So even though polling data suggests that Americans are quite split on the acronym DEI. Perhaps they're suspicious of that term because of all of the kind of weaponized politicization of that term, in the same way that we saw with other terms like CRT, a few years ago. Americans are overwhelmingly supportive of values like treating people fairly, ensuring that everyone has equal opportunity in society. And again, so poll after poll after poll shows that these values are wildly popular. So for as long as there are people out there in the community, and I speak to so many of them, who are passionate about ensuring that our systems are fair, that people are treated equally, that people have opportunity, I feel like equality can win, as the title suggests, right? It's not an inevitability. We all need to be part of that project in our own way, whether it's through, getting involved in nonprofits, engaging in activism, whether it's writing, hosting events, changing policies within your workplaces, your communities, starting a nonprofit, whatever it might be. We all have a part to play in this project, but there are so many of us who believe in this that continues to give me hope that ultimately we can prevail.
Thank you. Thank you both for such a rich and honest conversation. It's clear that equality work is hard, but it's also deeply possible. So I really appreciate you helping to provide a clear strategy about how we move forward in building that work. I hope that everyone will read your incredible book, How Equality Wins. And thank you again for the conversation. Thank you all for joining us.
Thank you so much, Deborah.
Thank you, Deborah. Appreciate it.